Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rodrigo Montes de Oca, and I am a research scholar at the Baker Institute Center for the United States and Mexico. On behalf of Tony Payan, director of the center, I want to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Cátedra México, an initiative established in 2021 by Rice University and the government of Mexico, through the Foreign Ministry and our friends and partners of the General Consulate of Mexico in Houston. The Cátedra México is a cooperation mechanism that aims to strengthen ties between academic institutions in Mexico and Rice University through research and cultural and academic exchanges. Its mission is, therefore, to lay bridges between our two nations. Today's keynote speaker, Dr. Silvia Giorguli, President of el Colegio de México, has been chosen by Mexico's Foreign Ministry as the inaugural holder of Cátedra México. Dr. Silvia Giorguli has served as President of el Colegio de México since 2015. It is important to note that she is the first female president of el Colegio de México, one of the top research and teaching universities for social sciences and humanities. Dr. Giorguli joined the faculty of the Center for Demographic, Urban, and Environmental Studies at El Colegio de México in 2003. She was the director of the center from 2009 to 2015. She was also the president of the Mexican Society of Demography from 2011 to 2012 and the founding director of the demographic journal Coyuntura Demográfica. Her research focuses on issues of international migration from Mexico to the United States and its impact on education and the structure of Mexican families on both sides of the border. She's a co-researcher of a major Mexican migration project organized by the Princeton University, the University of Guadalajara, and Brown University. She has participated in the binational dialogue on Mexican migrants in the United States and in Mexico, organized by the Centro de Investigaciones y Estudios Superiores en Antropología Social and Georgetown University. Dr. Giorguli studied sociology at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México, UNAM, and received a master's degree in demography from El Colegio de México and a doctorate in sociology from Brown University. She was a visiting fellow in 2007 at Stanford University Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Science. In 2018, she received the Horace Mann Medal from Brown University. Finally, I want to thank Ambassador Alicia Kerber and her team for all the support in the organization of this initiative. So now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Silvia Giorguli.
Good afternoon. For me, it's a real pleasure to be here at Rice University. I'm very thankful to Baker Institute for the invitation, and I would like to thank Tony Payan and Rodrigo Montes de Oca for the introduction and the invitation to be here. And I would like especially to thank also the consulate, Ambassador Kerber, and all her team for making this happen. And I think that it's very important to open spaces like this, like the Cátedra México, to have more spaces of discussion, of reflection, of exchange regarding topics that are of interest to both countries, in this case, Mexico and the U.S., and given Texas' location with such a strategic relation as the one that Mexico has with Texas. So I'm very happy to be here. What I decided to do for this presentation is to combine a set of issues. First, as Rodrigo already mentioned, I'm a demographer. So combine a bunch of issues that have to do with data, with recent data. And second, to summarize some of the discussions that we have been having in regional groups around the management of migration that had the participation of scholars and officials from the U.S., from Canada, from Mexico, and from Central American countries. So it's sort of a combination. And what I would like to do for this presentation is to try to bring us a little bit out of the short-term aspects of migration and not think only of what we see on the media every day, but to look at the broader picture. That's one of my goals. And my second goal is to try to bring out the perspective from Mexico. No, migration looks differently depending on where you're standing. And today it's even more complex than before for the Mexican case, and I hope to be able to show you how. And I will finish my presentation with some reflections around the management of migration and policy issues. Okay. So first, the scenario around international migration for the region between Canada, Mexico, United States, and the Northern Triangle of Central America has been complex. It's very complex. And I think that it's becoming more and more complex from the Mexican perspective. So we have flows of Mexicans moving to US, documented and undocumented migrants. We have a large flow of migration from US to Mexico, people moving either as return migrants and US citizens moving to Mexico, and I will show a little bit of data. We have a growing in-transit migration that is also very heterogeneous in terms of the countries of origin and the profile of migrants. We have migrants from Central America, both moving in search of asylum and also moving as a response to the economic setbacks and the environmental fragility in the region. And we have, and more recently very visible, other international moves to Mexico. Migrants coming from Haiti, from Venezuela, from Africa, from Russia, from Ukraine. The case of the Haitians is very interesting because it's a migration that left Haiti 10 years ago. They moved to Brazil or other South American countries, and now they are coming to Mexico. So this sort of illustrates the complexity of the scenario. Now, I would like, because it's so complex, to sort of disentangle and look it by sections. And I will start talking about those moving to the north. As we know, the US is and will remain for a long time as a very important magnet of migration, not only for Mexico or for Central America, but for the whole world. No? What I'm showing is an estimate by the Pew Research Center on the growth of the foreign-born population in the US up to the year 2065. No? So this is isolating the origin of migrants. This is what is projected according to the dynamics of the migrant population in the US. Now, the US is and will continue to be a strong magnet for international migrants worldwide. If we look at it in terms of the whole continent of the Americas, 20% of the population in Canada is foreign-born, and the next country with the largest proportion is the US with 15%. And then comes Costa Rica with 10%, and then lower proportions. So US and Canada both are the main magnets. In terms of the Mexico-US migration, we are talking about a migration that has more than 100 years in terms of this large exchange, that increased rapidly in terms of the number of Mexicans living in the US starting on the 70s. And here, what I'm showing is the population, the Mexican-born population living in the US since the year 1900. And well, the last data that we have is the 2020 on 10.6 billion. So when we look at that history, we're not talking about something that is happening just this year or last year. We're talking about a movement that started 100 years ago and that implies a lot of buildings of networks, families across the borders, economic ties that is also linked to trade and to what happens in the economic and labor markets on both sides of the border with different stages. No? But I think that is interesting, especially to look at what has been happening in the last 20 years or the last 15 years after the the Great Recession in the US. And after a very rapid growth in the number of Mexicans living in the US, it's sort of stabilized. And for the last 5 years, it has even been declining. There has been a small decline in the number of Mexicans living in the US, so that by the year 2020, the information that we have according to the American Community Survey is less than 11 million. No? So I think that is important to show this, because when we talk about the relationship between Mexico and the US and the role that migration has in that bilateral relation, we have to think that we are not at this stage. No? When we have this very rapid growth, I imagine the complexity of negotiating migration at this stage. But on the contrary, we now have a stable population. Still, very dynamic exchange, as I will show. Now, one of the questions that we have been hearing for the last 5-6 years is whether Mexican migration is over to US, no? Whether the number of Mexicans coming after this very sharp decrease in the number of Mexicans coming to the US after 2008, is Mexican migration to US over? And the next question was whether Central American migrants would be replacing the migration flows. For example, Mexican migration is very important in agriculture in certain states, in services. So what will be happening with such a dynamic economy as the one that the US have, and the creation of new jobs in services and agriculture? And it's very interesting, because if you put yourself in the beginning of this century, we couldn't anticipate what would happen afterwards. We had a very large flow of Mexicans. The top points are 2000 and 2004, with more than 600,000 Mexicans arriving per year in 2004, more than 700,000 in the year 2000, and a very small, that's the red, I don't know if it looks like red, but that's the line on the upper side. And down, what we have is the number of migrants coming every year to the US from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. So it was very different in terms of size. Then we have what happened with the Great Recession and this large decrease in Mexican migration, in the number of Mexicans arriving US every year, and an increase in the number of Central Americans from these three countries. Anyway, it's very small. Even though the Central American, the number was increasing, it was far, and it's still far from what we saw in the year 2000 and in the year 2004. And then we have the most recent statistics. I didn't put it because, well, if there are questions, I can tell why, but they are not totally comparable, the figures. But if we look at the total of new arrivals in 2020, again, according to the American Community Surveys, in the case of Mexico is less than 100,000, but there's still an important number of Mexicans coming every year, around 100,000, with a large component of documented migration. And then you have the total number coming from Central America, adding up to 55,000 in the year 2020. So 2020 was a very exceptional year, because due to COVID, there was this decrease in the number of migrants, especially from the Northern Triangle, but still we are far away from the scenario we were talking about at the beginning of the century. And sometimes we tend to forget this data. The second thing that is, I think it's very important, is that the composition of the migration flow has changed in this century. And one of the changes is that the number of immigrants arriving from Asian countries is larger than the number of immigrants coming from Latin America and the Caribbean. No? This is, again, a graph in terms of the proportion and how it has changed. At the beginning of the century, almost half of the migrants arriving were from Latin America, largely driven by this peak on Mexican migration. But then Asian migration surpassed, in relative terms, in terms of the immigrants arriving US every year. And it has sort of remained the same after 2018, no? So I think this is also an important data, because it's migration from Central America and from Mexico and from South America and the Caribbean is more visible in the media, for example, than the migration from Asia. And one of the questions has to do with why. Why is it more visible, and why does it create all these reactions and anti-immigrant sentiments? Okay. Now, the other thing that is very interesting around the flow is when we look at these large numbers, a large component of the numbers is documented migration, no? For example, for the last 5 years, the number of immigrant visas related to working permits has even increased, no? And we have a very large number of Mexicans receiving temporary workers visa for agricultural sectors especially, but also for services. And there's now this discussion about the need to increase the paths for legal migration for other countries, for example, for Central America, no? And that's one of the proposals that we have heard recently in this discussion on how to move forward in an orderly and humanitarian management of migration. So is Mexico-U.S. migration over? As I already mentioned, after the Great Recession, there was this decrease, but the flow had remained before COVID between 130,000 and 150,000 arriving U.S. yearly, with this component of documented migrants, which I want to call the population we share, because it may be dual citizens, or it may be American citizens naturalized, or it may be a population with a legal with green cards that can come and go. So it's a population that we share, but because it can work and move freely between both countries. There has also been an important increase in the number of temporary workers visas and mobility of Mexican migrants naturalized or with green cards. What happened after COVID? So after COVID, when we look at the big numbers, there was a decrease in the number of migrants in general crossing through the southern border. That in 2021, and especially this year, it started increasing again, and I will show some of the data. But the number of Mexicans was not reduced in the same proportion as the number of migrants from other countries. So I would like now to talk about border crossings. So because border crossings is the best proxy for the number of yearly entries into the U.S. Now we really don't know, but that's a very good, it gives us a very good sense. So I'm going to show first what happened before COVID-19. And again, we saw a very large change. In this graph, what you are seeing is the number of encounters by the Border Patrol at the southern border by country of origin. So in 2008, most of the encounters were Mexicans, which is the darkest color, and there was a very little presence of encounters or detentions of Salvadorians, Guatemalans, and Honduras. So throughout the next 10 years, there was this large change. I don't know if I have a light here, but if not, also. So that now we have a very, but before COVID, we have a very small number of Mexicans, and most of the encounters were from, mainly from Guatemala and Honduras, no? And a little bit from El Salvador. So that was a big change. First, a decrease in the number of encounters, and then again, an increase in the number of encounters, but with a very different composition by national origin. Now, what happened afterwards? So, as I was mentioning before, I think it's too soon to say that Mexican migration to the U.S. is over. The number of detentions was still higher, and Mexico concentrated the largest numbers. But we did see a very sharp decrease in the other countries. No? And then 2021, we see again a certain increase in the number of apprehensions. As you can see, for this table, I only use 1 month. As probably you have heard, the last months we have reached peaks in the number of apprehensions. And again, with a large participation of Mexico. And here I want to point out that in the Mexican case, there is this more heterogeneous panorama, because it's not only the labor migration that we were used to see 20 years ago, or the family reunification that started after the 80s, but we also are seeing a large component of population displaced by violence in their communities of origin, within Mexicans, no Mexicans displaced by violence. And then, I want to point out the data for Honduras, Guatemala, and Salvador, although very high compared to 2020, still far from what is happening for Mexico. Now, This is for just 1 month. When you look at accumulated for the whole year, yeah, we will see an increase in 2021 and probably 2022 regarding the apprehensions. Well, so you have there the data. And to these apprehensions, this is by the Border Patrol. You can add the number of detentions for the Central Americans by Mexican authorities that in 2021 added to more than 100,000. Okay, now another big change in the migration flow has to do with the profile, who is migrating and who they are migrating with. And again, when you look at the data, we used to have, in this case, the gray area is adults traveling alone, and this is family units, no? Families migrating together. So one of the largest changes in the last 10 years has to do with these migration flows of mainly adults, mainly men, but not only men, migrating by themselves, to now this profile, or this characteristic of families migrating together. And that is very important because it also means a change in the way that we manage migration. All the definition, for example, of how the Border Patrol works and the Mexican authorities work is concentrated on adults migrating alone. When you are dealing with families, well, you have to take into account issues such as children, keeping children with their parents, pregnant women, and all this implies different things for the management of migration. And the other issue that became more visible in 2014 has to do with this phenomenon of unaccompanied children, which are a very small proportion, but as you see, is stable and constant in time. And again, I point out the issue of unaccompanied minors because it's also a big challenge, given the framework of migration policies and the border control. No? Our systems, both in Mexico and the U.S., are not and were not prepared and designed to deal with vulnerable populations such as unaccompanied minors. Well, this is I showed here. I show here up to 2019 this graph that I took directly from the CBP, the Control and Border Patrol, shows the more recent data. And again, it's very interesting because after the pandemic, we saw a decrease in family units, and again, an increase in the number of adults traveling alone. But what is happening is that, again, the number of family units of family units in apprehensions increase in 2021, and it will probably reach or surpass the level of 2021 for 2022. Okay, so that is in terms of border crossing. Now let's move a little bit to what has happened to the Mexican population living in the U.S. And as we know, Mexico is the main country of origin for the total immigrant population in the U.S. However, it has decreased in terms of proportion because it has to do with what I showed you in the first graph and second graph on how the Mexican population has been first stagnant and then slowly decreasing. And then you have a very important increase in China and India. Here I didn't show the absolute data, but even in terms of arrivals, India has surpassed China, which is, I think it's very interesting. And again, we see this large proportion from Asian countries, and well, Salvador comes out with 3% in the 2020. This is the general composition. So here is the data, no? That I was mentioning in terms of the total population, and now India with a larger stock of immigrants than China. Okay. Now, in terms of the profile, there have also been large changes. We know that the immigrant population concentrates in adults in the productive years of life, no? But I would like to, in this table, I would like to stress two changes. First, it has to do with the time of residence in the U.S. So if we have close to, well, less than 11 million Mexicans living in the U.S., less than 3 million migrants from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, but the large majority of them concentrate in population that has lived in the US for more than 10 years. And I also think that this is a very important data, because we're not talking about population that arrived 1 year, 2 years, 3 years ago, that maybe if they are deported, they still have links in their countries of origins, probably family, housing, or but you're talking about population that left their countries of origin more than 10 years ago, that probably have lost most of their family networks in the countries of origin. And this is important because when we talk about return migration, for example, what happened in 2009, 2010, that we have a large increase in the number of Mexicans returning to the US, we were talking about Mexicans that were returning to a country that they didn't know anymore. First. And second, we have a lot of cases of migrants returning that had left the country when they were very young, younger than 10 years, and they were arriving to a country they didn't know at all because they were not socialized there, they didn't go to school probably there, etc. So this is an important data from the Mexican perspective. And the other issue is that there has also been a change in terms of the educational composition of the population, migrant population. So now we have still half, or a little bit more than half of the immigrants from Mexico and from the Northern Triangle have less than high school. So that's also important in terms of designing policies, integration to the labor market. But the proportion with tertiary education has increased. Still, we are far away from other Latin American groups in general regarding tertiary education, which talks about the negative selectivity by education of this population. And lastly, well, it has to do with undocumented migration. The undocumented migration, the undocumented migrants in the U.S. had been declining before COVID. We don't have yet new estimations on the undocumented population as a whole. We have, I think, the latest are for 2018. I didn't show them, but they are very similar to this table. There has been an increase in the undocumented migrants from Mexico, which means that part of this decrease in the total population also has to do with some undocumented migrants going back to Mexico. Again, we here have this, when you compare undocumented migration from Central America, it's similar in terms of, or was similar in terms of size in 2007 with the Asian migration, but it's probably the group that had increased the largest in terms of undocumented migration. So there are several issues to set aside from what I have mentioned regarding Mexicans living in the U.S. We have this situation of mixed statuses within the same family, uncertainty around the situation of the dreamers. And when I first started with this organization of information was probably 10 years ago, and say like, oh, I haven't changed that phrase, no? Uncertainty around the situation of the dreamers, with a lot of transnational linkages, and the best example are remittances that keep on growing and growing in a very difficult to explain the trend. But there are also some hypotheses saying like, well, yeah, but these transnational linkages will probably tend to get exhausted, no? Like, yeah, probably you send remittances to your parents and to your siblings, but as time goes by, probably they will disappear. And still large issues that are not so frequent in the recent migration debate as the situation of these migrants that have been living here for more than 10 years. And we don't know, with what's happening around the world with COVID and with the war and with inflation and economic recession, whether we will have a new wave of return migration to Mexico. Now, this is the last part, and it has to do with migration from the U.S. to Mexico. No? I like this part very much because so as I already mentioned, we have like this peak on return migration after the Great Recession, and then return migration stayed there. But we have migration from the U.S. to Mexico stayed there. But we have two different flows in the migration from the U.S. to Mexico. We have a group of adults, Mexican-born, that return to Mexico, not necessarily to the communities of origin, probably to large cities. But we have a very large group of young population, American citizens moving to Mexico. And that's the largest flow. I will show it in another table. That's the largest flow that Mexicans have. I don't know if you know, but also Mexico is the main recipient of American citizens as out migrants from the U.S. No, so okay, yeah, this one is the one I wanted to show. So one question that we have been discussing in Mexico is to what extent we are becoming a country of reception, a receiving country, no, and a country of immigration. I already mentioned that in the U.S. is close to 16% of the population that was born abroad. In Mexico is 1%, a little bit above 1%, no? So it's a little bit, according to the 2020 census, is a little bit above 1 million, and it hasn't grown a lot. But of these 1 million, as you may see, more than 70% come from the U.S. Our main immigrant group are American citizens coming to the U.S. That has this large component of a very young population, a group of population above 65, and then a group of adults. But most of them are population that is below 18 years of age, and that I like to call them the population we share, because many or most of them are dual citizens. No? And then you have migration from Guatemala, Venezuela, Colombia, Honduras, others. And again, I here always like to compare what is happening in Mexico with this large flow of immigrants coming from Central America, from Haiti, and from South America, with what is happening in Colombia. Colombia, which is quite smaller than Mexico, like half of the population of Mexico, in the last 5 years received close to 3 million migrants from Venezuela, no? And they have been able, with problems, it's not perfect, but they have been able to manage it and give a legal way of entry for Venezuelans that are currently living in Colombia. So when they say like, no, there are so many immigrants coming to Mexico, I say, well, the data doesn't tell you that, no? It's something probably more related to the images that we have around migration. Okay. So now I only have 2 more slides, and then we can open to questions and comments, of course. So first, I think that it's very important to understand in the narrative around migration that migration is something that has happened in our countries for centuries, and that it's going to be here and that will continue in the near future and in the long term, no? That we have this combination of economic, probably we think a lot, when we think about the history of Mexico and U.S. migration, we think about people working on the railways, on the agricultural fields, on services. But now we have all this combination of families, mixed families, the family reunification. We have the economic reasons that have always existed. We have the violence in Mexico and the violence in Central America that will not be solved in the short term. So we will have population with an urgent need to move somewhere else. And we have this additional element of climate change and environmental fragility. Not that will also be a driver of migration. How do we imagine our common border in the near and medium term future? And here again, well, in 2018, in 2019, Mexico promoted a pact towards orderly, efficient, humanitarian management and regular management of migration. The U.S. did not subscribe the pact, it was a world pact, but it sort of defined the directions of where we want to move. No, so far, migration has had such a high human cost in terms of deaths, in terms of family separation, in terms of anxiety and depression among migrants and their families, in economic terms, that I think that there's a large incentive to try to look and think of different ways on the management of migration. Now, one of the issues, and I always like to say that when people talk about the migration crisis, I say, well, no, it's not a migration crisis which is the fault of migrants. There's a crisis in the institutions that are in charge of managing migration, because all these changes that I have shown you have surpassed and have go over the institutional frameworks that we designed in the 80s. No? Just to give an example. So here, as I mentioned, if we think that we're going to have a continued migration from Central America and from Mexico, extra-regional flows, this combination of factors, and also a change in socio-demographic profiles, with a very good example is the number of minors migrating along. And this one I also mentioned it. But so I think that we need to look at different institutional frameworks. First, I'm going to put gaps and inefficiencies in the U.S. migration system in the U.S. and in Mexico, no? On both sides. So as we mentioned, the U.S. has a problem, an issue that hasn't been found a way to solve it efficiently, that has to do with this large undocumented population who arrived more than 1 decade ago or who arrive as minors. That's the case of the Dreamers. But there's also a problem with the refugee and asylum systems that have not been able, although it has been, although the U.S. government has acknowledged that there's a problem, it has been very slow in terms of changing it and finding ways out to issues such as the large time that it takes to process applications. We have vulnerable population, which is a very vulnerable or certain statuses, such as the TPS and the DACA, we already know. And I do think that when we talk about border control, this idea of the humanitarian management of migration is one of the main issues, no? For the Mexican case, well, we have also very specific problems. For example, we had in the past this set of programs for returning migrants where the consulates have been very important in terms of informing migrants and their families, but now it's sort of like in a void. It's not very clear the strategy to support in returning migrants in their trips back home and in the integration. Issues such as having an ID to open a bank account or to rent a spot for Mexicans returning after being away for more than 10 years is a real problem. Of course, we have a problem in the management of both borders, the northern border and the southern borders of Mexico. The refugee and asylum systems are also overloaded. They have more applications than what they can process. They don't have enough financial resources and human resources to face the challenge that they have. There's a separation in the discourse between the humanitarian management of migration that Mexico subscribed and promoted through the World Pact and what we see every day in the field. And there's the problem of human traffic and this overlap between the organized crime and its activities and the traffic of undocumented migrants. Mexico is also lagging behind in terms of integration. It has been an issue in the U.S. because the U.S. understands itself as a country of immigrants. No, so for more than 100 years, they have been discussing you have been discussing about the integration of children in school, about naturalizations and everything. In Mexico, we are lagging behind because we haven't seen ourselves as a receiving country. And well, yeah, of course, that needs a lot of to create actions, specific actions and public policies, which requires infrastructure, human and financial resources. So this is a broad scenario. There are a lot of specific recommendations and probably other issues such as how to tackle the causes of migration. That has been one of the strategies that the Mexican government and the U.S. government have mentioned regarding what we are living today on migration trends. But the main challenge is how to move towards a secure, orderly, efficient, and regular management of migration after COVID. Well, thank you very much.
Creo que este micrófono. Okay, we are going to take some questions, but first I want to ask you one question. And sorry if I jump from one topic to another, but I want to pick your brain in different topics. In my opinion, nowadays it is clear that the Biden's and López Obrador administration are choosing different paths on the complex issues that affect the U.S.-Mexico relations. One example is President López Obrador absent at the Americas Summit. Do you think that the idea of Robert Pastor of North America as an integrated region could be recovered in the following years?
Not a very easy question. No, well, I have two things that I would like to mention. First, something that has become very interesting is that international migration has been, but today is more visible, an issue across all the Americas. No, I already mentioned the case of Colombia and Venezuela. No, so Venezuela has lost 20% of its population in the last 5 years. And Venezuelans are moving to the US, to Mexico, to Colombia, to Ecuador, to Peru, to Chile, to Costa Rica. We have a very large flow between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. We have return migration to Ecuador from Spain and from the US, and at the same time, Ecuador is receiving Venezuelans. So I do think that today it's a very good opportunity to try to think whether we can create a common dialogue about international migration in the whole Americas. And the America Summit was a space for that, and in fact it ended with this declaration around migration. So where, even though López Obrador was not there, Mexico tried to cover a leading role. No? The Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard had led, for example, he was one of the leading actors in the sign of the World Pact in 2019. He had prepared some meetings with the embassies of Latin American countries and Canada in Mexico before the America Summit, and they had already tried to point certain general directions, such as an agreement around humanitarian protection, an agreement around exploring the possibilities to increase the paths to legal migration, and the investment in development in sending communities. So it's sort of contradictory, no?
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah, no, go ahead, please.
No, well, and I forgot what was the second one, so I will remember.
Okay. Now, in your role as president of El Colegio de Mexico, you're one of the few women presidents of a top university in Mexico. I did some research, and I only found one more, Dr. Cecilia Naya, who is the interim president of the Universidad de las Américas, Puebla. Considering your successful and unique professional experience, what is your advice for women who want to stand out in the academic world?
Yeah, that's another difficult question. No, first I would like to say that, in fact, the number of women who are presidents of university in Mexico has increased in the last 5 years, especially in public universities. No? So now we have the Universidad Veracruzana had a president who just finished, and who I have to say, for me, was very important because I haven't met her before I became president, but she was the first one to congratulate me and gave me a sort of ideas of what I would be facing coming into a very manly environment. The president of the Universidad Autónoma de la Ciudad de México, which is the third largest system in Mexico City among the universities. The president of the Universidad Autónoma de Nayarit, she just took office a couple of weeks ago. So there has been an increase in the number of women in higher education. For me, it was very surprising because El Colegio de México is a university that is concentrated in human science and humanities and social sciences. And we know that the presence of women in social science and humanities is higher than in engineering, mathematics, or in the hard sciences, no? In a sense. So for me, it was very surprising to see that there hadn't been women in not even as president, in any of the high positions of presidents or vice president of international affairs or academic affairs. There hadn't been any woman. What advice I would give, I think that in my case, and this is like a very personal statement, in my case, there was a large project behind. There was an idea of what we wanted to do at El Colegio de México, what we think, and I'm talking collectively because it was not only me, it was a project discussed with colleagues from other, from my colleagues at El Colegio de México, and that's the reason I decided to enter. I mean, I knew that I would be the only woman, and but that was not, I didn't see that as a reason for not entering the process, no? And not using the space to talk about what we thought El Colegio needed at that moment.
Okay, great. Now regarding education, Mexico and Latin America region are experiencing an education crisis due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some studies show that millions of students drop out school for different reasons, but mainly to support their families financially. As an education expert, what is your view about the future of education in Mexico and what the country has to do to eliminate these education inequities?
No, I am very worried, very, very worried. Not only at higher education and tertiary education, but also at the basics, no? So we have a problem of large dropout, especially of the population between 15 and 18 years of age. And then, but we also have a problem in terms of achievement of what children learn during these 2 years, no? And the problem is that the COVID-19 make evident new sources of inequality that we didn't know. No, if you can imagine a child taking a distance learning class in his or her room with a tablet or a laptop, and then you would have another children taking the class with the 3 or 4 brothers and sisters next to him on an iPhone or not an iPhone, on a cell phone, and in some cases without any access to connections or to internet. No? So that created a large source of inequality, not only in Mexico, but in the whole Latin America. And that is more difficult. I mean, of course, the dropout is very difficult to attend, but the learning processes and what was lost, the loss in terms of learning mathematics, reading and writing skills, that's something more difficult to compensate. And Mexico was already lagging behind in verbal skills and mathematical skills compared to the international scenario. I think that we would need a very assertive initiative from the government to design actions, programs to involve teachers into a larger initiative to recover what was lost. No, the problem is that I don't see it not in Mexico and not in the rest of the region yet. It's again, things happen and the policies are always lagging behind. No.
Yeah.
So we may have it in 1, 2, or 3 years, but then what happened with those children that were already moving out of the school system? So I think that it's a topic that is urgent, because in what we had already gained, there's several steps back that we moved. No?
Okay, I'm going to jump back to the migration issues. Yeah, you touched some points in your presentation, but I really want to ask you this question. In the U.S., every month, we hear in the news that a new migrant caravan, especially from Central America, is heading to the U.S. I think that it's a very complex problem, but what could be the first step to try to solve this problem? Like the first public policy or the first action from the government?
I think that the governments of all the countries involved, the countries of origin, the countries in transit, should be very worried about this overlap between organized crime and the trafficking of migrants. No? So I know that there's a large discussion in terms of the entries and what it implies in terms of giving temporary entries, for example, to cross Mexico. So I know that there's a large unsolved debate there, and that it's very difficult to find an agreement there. But the issue of organized crime and the disappearance of migrants and the way organized crime is profiting from all this is something that is transnational, that goes beyond borders, and that would be at least the starting point to try to find a common strategy to avoid that. I do believe, and that's something I was looking at the picture of Madeleine Albright in one of the photographs at the entry. We were in this group where Lloyd Axworthy, that was Canadian Foreign Ministry some decades ago, and Madeleine Albright were leading. And one of the main conclusions was, I have already mentioned, but it's worth repeating it, trying to find a legal paths for this migration. No?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Silvia. Now we can take some questions. If you raise your hand. Yeah, please, Pam, and then
Hi.
Anna.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is about aging in the U.S. We know that in the next decade, aging is going to be a very big problem in the U.S. And so how does that intersect with immigration? And I also saw in one of your slides is, you know, when Mexicans are returning back to their countries, is age a factor in that? As they age, when they get older, do they return?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So should I answer one by one?
If you like, if we can take one more. Okay, aging and immigration, Anna.
Sure. I have a couple questions for you, but first of all, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. And you know, I think it's fair to say that Mexico is, and maybe you disagree, but I think it's fair to say that Mexico is increasingly becoming a country of destination rather than a transit country for migrants. And I think this is in part due to more restrictive policies in the U.S., such as Title 42, MPP. So my first question is, how do you think the Mexican government has handled these influx of refugees or asylum seekers trying to seek asylum or some other kind of protection in Mexico, especially in cities like Tapachula? And then my second question is, how do you think this has affected the bilateral relations between Mexico and the U.S.? Because it's, again, in part because of stricter U.S. policies. So how has that affected the relationship between the two countries?
Okay. You want me to
Okay.
take the last one? I wasn't.
Yes. Yeah.
I have a question about Mexico turning inward with laws, inward to, and what that will do to the outmigration if the economy and things deteriorate. There'll be more external, there'll be more people leaving than we have now. And I think maybe the United States and other countries should plan for that, because you can't change a government, but you can respond positively about how we deal with the children and the people that are coming no matter what. Because we have a policy now of 2 million legal migrants every year, plus the others. So it's not that we can't deal with it. I think we should look at it ahead of time and try to plan accordingly.
Okay, thank you.
When you mean Mexico turning inward, you mean kind of
Philosophically, oil, energy,
okay.
More nationalistic approach.
pushing out external energy resources, and what that'll do to the economy if it shrinks
Okay.
and you turn to be, like, go back to the 1930s and the energy policy, what that would do to job security or job availability in the population of all the young people.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. Regarding aging and migration, I like those questions because I'm a demographer. So yes, if you look at the data, again, if you look at the whole continent, Canada and the U.S. are the countries who are aging the fastest. No, so yeah, you can anticipate that there will be two issues. One, the increase in the job positions in what ILO calls the white economy, care work, no? Care work. And the second, in terms of, okay, so you will need to replace the labor force that is going out because it's retiring. The issue is that the whole continent is going rapidly also towards a demographic convergence, no? So, for example, the total fertility rate, the number of children, the average number of children in the U.S. is higher than the average number of children per woman in El Salvador, no? So, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti may be like lagging a little bit behind, but countries such as Uruguay and Argentina are also going through an aging process already. El Salvador is also going through an aging process, and Mexico is also entering an aging process. No? So this idea of demographic complementarity, of having like countries with a large number of young population coming out, demographically in terms of accumulated numbers, it's not necessary that way. No? So there's a combination of factors. And the second issue that you asked regarding aging and return migration, yeah, when you look at return migration, you have a combination of flows, no? So you have this combination of whole families moving together, adults returning alone. The data does not allow us to separate voluntary and involuntary return migration, so we cannot really know. So, and you do have a segment of population that is above 60, which is probably related to their own retirement. Some of them, well, Karen can talk about that. Some of them with documents to come and go, because probably part of the family stays here, of their children and grandchildren stay here, and the other part there, so that they can come and go. And even in some cases, and again here the consulates and the foreign service is very important, that need certain medical attention that they cannot get in the U.S. due to the cost or because they do not have the access to it, so they go back to Mexico even. So you have a combination of factors. Still, most of the return migrants, again, concentrate in young adults, no? But you do have the other cases.
Mexico becoming a country of destination.
Yeah. Mexico as a country of destination. So there's a great book wrote by a historian from el Colegio de Mexico called Pablo Yankelevich that is called Los Otros. And it's a book about the reception of migrants in Mexico throughout history in the past century. And it's terrible. I mean, what the stories that he tells about Chinese migrants, European migrants, no, but mainly Chinese migrants, migrants coming from South America, from Central America, it's terrible. No? He says, so Mexico has a problem in terms of defining the entry policies, no? And has a distance. What is very interesting is because Mexico has been very assertive in the international level regarding the humanitarian management of migration flows, even before we talk about humanitarian management. No? So there's still a separation in the discourse between what happens at the high official levels and what happens on the field. No? So when you're mentioning the case of the southern border, and the images that we have had of the National Guard trying to stop migrants and deterring them, well, it's not consistent with what we listen at the so that's at the government level. But also something that happens, and I'm being very critical here, is that Mexico has not also solved this part of being a multicultural country regarding immigrants. No? So, as I mentioned, we don't have integration policies, or we have very few examples of integration policies. We don't have good examples, as Mexico City, for example, has an intercultural law for migration. No? But we have very few examples of integration policies. We have a lot of expressions of discrimination and xenophobia against certain migrant groups. So I think we need to talk about them, and we need to learn how to deal with that. And I always like to show the data, because yes, Mexico is the number of immigrants is increasing, but still we are very far from other countries that have learned or have solved and have a more positive management of migration. No? So that's being very, very, very critical. And I do think that that migration is now part of the bilateral relation. No? So a couple of decades ago, you would listen migration experts saying like, no, we don't want migration to contaminate the U.S. Mexico relationship. For example, when the NAFTA agreement was being discussed, no, we don't want to talk about migration. In fact, migration was left out of the NAFTA agreement, no, because it sort of looked as a source of contamination of other aspects such as trade. But I think now it's clear that the migration is a central part, is if not, well, the most central part in the bilateral relation. An example was, this negotiation with the Trump administration regarding trade tariffs, and the control of the border. So yeah, the issues now are intertwined, no? But I do also think, because we tend to stress more the negative than the positive. On the other side, we had never had the number of temporary working visas for Mexico and the option of legal entries for Mexicans today as we have had ever in the past. No? So I think that we have both components in the role that migration is playing in the bilateral. There are issues, for example, that we have learned a lot, and again, consulates have been very important in the past regarding agreements on deportation, where to return people at what times, etc. So there are other specific issues where we need to work together. No? And other transnational issues, as I already mentioned, such as human trafficking and the role of organized crime in migration, undocumented migration. And finally, about Mexico turning inward and planning ahead. So as I mentioned, migration is one of the most uncertain social responses to what is happening around, no? I already mentioned, so we were at the beginning of this century, nobody was anticipating this large decrease in the number of Mexicans arriving the U.S. in the following years, no? And again, for example, in the case of Colombia, Venezuela is also very interesting because Colombia was a country of out-migration, and Venezuela was the country of destination of some of those flows. And within a decade, it totally changed. No? So yes, migration is a very rapid response. I would be very worried about violence-driven migration, no? Migration as a forced displacement, because I do not see a solution in the short term to the situation of violence that Mexico and Northern Central America are experiencing. No, so in immediate terms, I think that's one of the will continue to be one of the drivers. No, now on the other part of the economic dynamics, because what you're saying is that probably a result of this change in the policies would be a problem in terms of economic options or alternatives for the Mexican youth, for example. No. So yeah, I think it will also remain as an incentive. Now the thing today is that it's very difficult to separate one from the other, no? If you have a small business in a town in Mexico that you have to close because the organized crime is asking you for money that you cannot pay, and you move out, what is it? Is it because you lost your economic opportunity or a response to violence, no? So I think that it's mixed together, and but I do agree with you that we need to anticipate that these flows will keep and may even intensify. In fact, after COVID, I mean, it's too soon because we still need to analyze the data, but after COVID, what we have seen is an increase in Mexican migration to the U.S. through, or at least attempts to cross the border for population without documents, which add to the already documented paths. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Thank you very much, Silvia. Thank you very much for your presentation. Congratulations, because you are the inaugural holder of Cátedra México. And please join me to thank Dr. Giorguli.